Hello and welcome to this special bonus episode of God in Film. I'm your host, writer and Welsh matinee idol Giles, and this isn't the start of Series 5, though we will be bringing that to you as soon as humanly possible. But in the meantime, I thought you'd like a little taster of what you can expect from our Patreon page. Back in November, I was interviewed by Chick Yuill on Premier Christian Radio. I got to talk about how I became a Christian and why I think film is such an important medium for having conversations about the big questions in life. If you're thinking of subscribing to our Patreon page, you can get access to bonus content like our God in Music episode, scripts for every episode we've ever done, and very soon our extra special God in Gaming episode. Just look for www.patreon.com/God in Film podcast. And now, if that's not doable, then could I politely ask you to help us out by leaving a glowing review or telling anyone about the show? It could be a friend, a neighbour, or even just one of your RE students in your 1 A-level class. I hope you enjoy the interview.
Well, good morning. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. That was Leland singing about worship. And this is Faith, Hope and Love, where we express our worship in good conversation, faith-lifting music, and by taking a hard look at what's happening around us from a Christian perspective. So this is not a time to retreat or escape from the world, but rather an opportunity to be refreshed and equipped to go back out into the world with the love of Jesus in our hearts. And just saying that takes me all the way back to 1953. Now, picture a classroom filled with 5-year-olds. The teacher comes in and tells the children that they're all going to be taken to the local cinema to see cartoons, a special treat to celebrate the upcoming coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The kids are delighted and begin to cheer, all except one little boy who knows his Christian duty. He gets up from his seat and walks slowly but determinedly to the front of the class, where he raises his hand and makes the speech he knows he has to deliver. "Please, miss," he says, "I won't be coming to the cinema. My family are Christians, and we don't attend places of worldly entertainment." Now, I know that's a true story, because, as you might well have guessed, I was that little boy. And that's how many Christians responded to popular culture when I was a lad. Thankfully, we have a healthier appreciation of the arts today, and we've moved away from that kind of separation. But that, of course, carries its own dangers. How do we engage with popular culture without being ensnared by values that are sometimes less than Christian? Well, I'm glad to have as my guest this morning someone who might be able to help us think that through. Giles hosts and produces a podcast that looks at the world of film and asks if and how the stories they tell might shed light on the truth of the gospel. Welcome, Giles. But before we get to all that, I want to know your faith story. How did you come to commit your life to Jesus?
Well, I was born into a Catholic family in North Wales in the 80s, and I was baptized, had First Holy Communion. I was even an altar boy, Chick, and yet
I can't quite imagine you as an altar boy, Giles. But
you could see me in the cassock. I can rock that look, you know. So we were part of a Catholic family, but God didn't really seem real to us in any reasonable way. It started to get to the point where church became something you just did on a Sunday, and then my mum started taking us to a different church on a Sunday evening, which for me was terrible because Star Trek was on at exactly the same time, so I kept missing it. So that was already we were off to a bad start. And they brought my brother and sister, and some family friends were sort of dragged along as well. So we had 2 of our friends there, and it was very happy clappy, very charismatic, nothing even close to what we were used to in terms of what a church service was look like. And we would sort of huddle together and be like, right, we all hate this, right? This is terrible. Like, oh yeah, we hate this. Yeah, okay, all right, good. And then you gradually start coming to the youth service and you start getting to know people, and there's this gradual waning over time amongst my friendship group where they're like, "Oh, don't know, maybe it's not so bad." I'm like, no, we hate this. We all agreed. Why am I the only one that still hates it? And all my brothers and sisters, my brother and sister, my friends, they all sort of became Christians before I did. I was the last holdout. I was furiously sitting there going, no. And then one night, the preacher has an altar call, and she's talking about hell. And, well, put bluntly, Chick, I didn't know much about hell. I just didn't know. I knew that I didn't want to go there. So my logic was, right, well, I don't want to go to hell. Sounds like I've got to become a Christian by what these guys understand it. Okay, I'll go up to the front as soon as the song starts singing. And then, as if she'd read my mind, she said, and you don't have to wait for the songs to start singing before you go. You can come up now. So I'm like, oh, well, I am doing this now. So there's 14-year-old me walking from the very back of the church to the very front of the church. And my youth leader comes up at the time and he says, all right, Giles, do you want to pray for anything? And I say quite tentatively, I would like to get saved. And I swear he has a smile on his face that must have been hurting the back of his head. It was so broad. So that's the point. I become saved. And you know what it's like when you become a Christian? The enormity of it doesn't quite hit you for some time, does it? It's only after a while where it starts to kind of work into you, starts to become part of who you are. Since then, that is 25 years ago this year. And my walk with God has been, it's not always easy. There's always challenges, both inside, just in your work life, in your home life, and in your faith life. But the thing I always like to think about God is he's like a safety net. He never lets me fall too far. And you get those Christians who their faith increases when everything's sunny, or their faith increases when everything's terrible. I'm one of the it gets better when it's terrible ones. I lean more into God when I've got no other options, basically. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and my faith.
The 14-year-old Giles Goff giving his heart to Jesus. Thanks for sharing that with us, Giles. By the way, if you've just switched on your radio, well, it's 14 minutes past 10, and you're listening to Faith, Hope and Love with me, Chick Yuill, here on Premier Christian Radio. And by the way, at any point, you're free to join the conversation. So just let me explain how you do that. You can drop me an email at studio@premier.org.uk, studio@premier.org.uk if you'd like to email me, or you can text me on 66777. Make the first word of your message Premier. 66777 to text me, but make sure the first word of your message is Premier, and that gets right through to me. And you can join the conversation that I'm sharing with Giles Goff anytime. Okay, Giles, so here you are. For the last 20 odd years, you've been a Christian, but you also have a real interest in contemporary culture. Tell us how that came about. You kind of hinted at you with your love of Star Trek when you were a kid, but how did all that develop?
I'll be honest, Chick, your story about being the little kid who couldn't go to the cinema absolutely broke my heart. I was thinking, no, it's okay. It'll be fine. There's probably not going to be anything that heretical in a cartoon.
Oh, you know what, Giles? It breaks my heart when I remember it. And I wonder what those cartoons were about. But you're right, it is. But that was Christian thinking in many circles back then.
Well, for me, I love stories. I always have done. And I think being the asthmatic kid who had no hand-eye coordination meant that sport was well and truly out for me. So I would be the kind of person walking along with his nose in a book, deftly avoiding lampposts before it was cool and people were doing it with their phones. I love reading. I love watching TV. I love watching films. And that's transitioned into making short films or writing poems, all that sort of thing. Anything where you get to sort of share a little bit of yourself or a little bit of your perspective on something. I love creating things. It's really difficult, and I love being able to sort of pick apart and take apart a film or a TV show. Those people that say, "Oh, I go to the cinema to turn my brain off," seems so strange to me. I'm like, but that's when my brain turns on. That's when there's so many things to take apart. And as I've gotten older, that's transitioned into my career. I was an English teacher, English film and drama and media for about 10 years. And these days I am a writer. I write for Premier. I write for Education Resources. And one of my favorite things to do is just to sort of find a particular angle or theory and apply it to a film and then write about that.
Giles, I want to go back to what you said about story, loving story, because again, going way back to my childhood, which admittedly was a long time ago, but there was even then a kind of mistrust of novels and fiction. You know, you could read Christian biographies, especially on a Sunday, but you know, you obviously find story so powerful. What is it about story that is so meaningful, so important?
Well, it's the most effective teaching resource we've got, basically. I think like Jesus used stories all the time. He said there was a man and he was looking for his lost sheep, so he left the 99, and people would then understand how God felt about their love for them. Stories, not only do they have a value in their own right, but they are the most effective way to get a message across to something. And for me, when I was teaching, you could talk about gender politics when you were teaching an Inspector Calls, or you could talk about love and impulsiveness when you're teaching Romeo and Juliet. You could talk about, let's try not to kill the king, guys, when teaching Macbeth, but that didn't really come up that much. And it's just the best way I know, or anybody else knows, to really get something to stick in people's mind. And stories can also work as a form of therapy. It's being able to sort of take the things you're thinking and feeling and create them in a package that other people can see. It's this amazing idea where you have an image in your mind and you have a story in your mind, and it only exists in your mind. And being able to take it out and turn it onto film feels like absolute magic to me. The strangest thing I've also found as well is where I'm writing a character. We made a short film called Reset, which was all about a depressed artist who has a little AI assistant that comes to help him. And it's only sometimes when you look at something that you realize they're talking about how they're depressed and how they feel futile. And then you go, oh, good Lord, I'm talking about myself there. That's me talking to me through my stories, and I didn't realize it. So it just seems odd to me that anybody would shun them as a format.
It's really interesting to me, this growing in appreciation of story as we live in an increasingly fragmented world. And I think too about, again, going way back to my youth and when I first began to read some theology and that kind of thing, a lot of Bible scholarship was all about analyzing and breaking things down. Seems to me the great shift has been that we've learned to see the Bible as, above all, a great overarching story that makes sense of life. In fact, the only story that ultimately, brings it all together. So I think there's been a real discovery of just, as the world has become more broken and more difficult, story has become for us a way of finding some kind of sense and direction in it all.
100%, absolutely. And I think the other thing that comes in useful is the multiplicity of interpretations, the idea that you can read something in a different way and it's useful for you in whatever that context is. One of the things I always love is when a sermon says, now they use this word here in this English translation, but if we go back to the Hebrew, it actually had these connotations, and it can absolutely turn it on its head. The thing, like I said, the thing I love about a story is that it can work in different contexts and be useful to people that are centuries apart.
So we're agreed on that. We love stories, and I get it. Listeners at home are nodding. Yeah, I love stories too. Now, you do a podcast at God in Film. Tell us a little bit about the podcast and the kind of thinking behind it and the format of the show.
Sure. Okay. So the God in Film podcast is where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any of the Bible stories. So you might have already figured this out. I am the Christian in there, and my friend Phil Coleman is the atheist. And I absolutely adore talking to Phil. He's my filmmaking partner. We make films together. We make podcasts together. And he has a wonderful way of kind of puncturing the self-importance of Christianese. One of the rules that we have on the podcast is no Christianese whatsoever, but occasionally it'll kind of slip out. So I'll say that somebody is really on fire for God, and Phil will stop me and go, on fire for God? And I'll say, yeah, it means when you're really passionate about God. And he'll say, could we not have chosen a phrase that was less flammable? So it really makes you sort of question all the things you normally take for granted. We tend to focus predominantly on what I call mainstream films. So for the most part, we've stayed away from films about Jesus or biblical epics or things like that, because for the most part, there's enough Christian criticism and analysis to go with that. But there's not that many people looking at A Muppet's Christmas Carol from a Christian slant. And that's why I felt that it would be most useful. For me, the podcast has two audiences, as you might have figured out. So first of all, it's good for atheists because it lets them know that we're not too weird. We're not totally inaccessible, and we have the similar values in a lot of areas.
And the we being Christians, yeah.
Yeah, we being Christians. Yeah. So again, there's that sort of bias that you have just working in the background, and it works for Christians because it gives us cultural references outside our own little church culture. Chick, you must have taught thousands of sermons by now, right?
More than a few, yeah.
More than a few.
By the way, Giles, I'm the one who's supposed to be asking the questions here.
Sorry, force of habit. Either way, you have preachers who are listening to other preachers, and they'll tell the story of the man who's in his house and the flood is coming, and he gets a radio warning, and he gets a boat showing up, and he gets a helicopter. And to each of them, he says, "No, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. God will save me." He gets to heaven. And he says, "God, why didn't you save me?" And he said, "Well, I sent you a radio broadcast. I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter. Why didn't you respond to any of those?" And you've heard that story. I've heard that story. I'm fairly confident most of the people listening have heard that story. And as a result, it's lost a lot of its cut through because you can start to switch off for a little bit.
Yeah, and you know what? I've got in defense of preachers, I've got to say, of course, that Aaron Sorkin uses exactly the same story in The West Wing. Hoist by your own petard.
Hoist by my own petard, yeah.
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation. We've got to take a break.
Absolutely.
But we'll be right back after that. You're listening to Faith, Hope and Love with me, Chick Yuill, here on Premier Christian Radio. And I'm talking to Giles Goff about his podcast God in Film and about how we engage with popular culture. We engage without being ensnared by values that are less than Christian. We'll be right back picking up that conversation after this. Yes, indeed. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio, where the time is 33 minutes past 10. This is Faith, Hope and Love. I'm Chick Yuill, and I'm in conversation with Giles Goff, who hosts and produces a podcast that looks at the world of film. He does it in dialogue with an atheist, and that's a kind of interesting dynamic, Giles, that you and an atheist look at it together, asking the God questions.
Yeah, it's me and Phil. We do a fun little section at the start called Phil's Facts, where he takes me through all the little sort of trivia about the film. And for me, I'm obsessed with reading up on trivia whilst watching a film. So the temptation to sort of just go on IMDb whilst watching it has to be curbed for this bit. We tend to have lots of guests as well. We've had professors, Lord of the Rings extra, a Doctor Who writer, debt management charity workers. We had one Muslim guest, and we had the occasional exorcist talking to us as well. So we have a really nice, fair variety of people who come on the show.
Mention of The Exorcist reminded me of what an eclectic mix of films you look at. I mean, films and television programs. I'm just looking at the list: Broadchurch, Doctor Who, The West Wing, Blade Runner, A Muppet Christmas Carol, The Passion of the Christ, The Exorcist. I mean, that's an amazing list. So here's what I want to ask you. Let's take just two of those, very different films. Now, I can't think of two films that could be more different than A Muppet Christmas Carol and The Exorcist. I mean, that really is something else. So tell us how you dealt with those and what you discovered as you did that.
Do you know what? It's fascinating. If we take the Muppets Christmas Carol at first,
a good place to begin.
We like the definitive Muppets definitive Christmas Carol, as far as I'm concerned. We had our friend Julia Hall, who was like a super fan, coming on to talk about it. And what I found was that to me, it seems a little bit like Christian fan fiction. There's a verse, I forget where it is. I think it might be in Luke, where it's the Lazarus and the rich man, and the sort of Lazarus sort of eats the scraps from his table. The rich man lives well. They both die. The rich man goes to Hades, I think it is, and Lazarus goes to be in the arms of Abraham, I think is the way it's phrased. And there's the bit where the rich man says, please, Abraham, Father Abraham, send Lazarus to dip his finger in some water and put it in my mouth to just take the edge off my suffering. And Abraham says no, and he says, well, could you send Lazarus back to tell my brothers and sisters of what's coming? And Abraham says no, they've got Moses and the prophets, and if they won't listen to them, then they're not going to listen to the dead. I'm sure at some point Charles Dickens must have read that and went, yeah, but what if they could, though? Because it's the starting point for this story is all about what if you could have somebody come back from the dead and try to change somebody's conscience. Dickens used to write everything as serialized. This is one of the few that all came out as one piece. He wrote it in 6 weeks. Chicks, you've written more books at the moment. How many of them took you about 6 weeks from start to finish?
It took me a lot longer than that. I'm a very slow writer. But you know what? Even I am not arrogant enough to compare myself to Charles Dickens.
Fair play. And it's just fascinating to look at it, because he's taking these characters and just, I love looking at things and seeing that the Bible is the jumping off point in there. You know, I find that absolutely fascinating. And obviously the other thing we looked at is that I think Charles Dickens's faith has probably impacted the way Western people see Christmas more than any other person I can think of. Obviously, Dickens, his feeling was, let's not get too bogged down in the theology and the doctrine, and let's focus on being good to people and helping those in need, which is absolutely fantastic until you take it 2 or 3 more steps further, when it becomes, let's completely ignore the doctrine and theology and let's just be good to people for a few weeks a year, and that will take the edge off our conscience. So it's really fascinating the way that one book has impacted, I don't know, every single aspect of Western Christianity since then.
But yeah, I mean, that's fascinating reflections. But you could have looked at them. There must be a dozen movies on Christmas Carol. What was the attraction about the Muppet Christmas Carol?
Because the Muppets Christmas Carol is the best one, Chick. I will brook no discussion on this point. There's some that have Patrick Stewart, and that's great. And there's some amazing Jim Carrey ones. And there's ones that go back throughout pretty much the entire history of cinema, but only one of them has Gonzo in it. And that's the thing we need to focus on at this point, I feel.
Well, you've settled the argument once for all. Now, let's look at a very different film, The Exorcist, which for a lot of Christians would be a real no-no area. How did you deal with that? What did you bring out of that?
So what that came from, we originally started doing series that were about sort of 10 episodes long. And both myself and Phil started it in the pandemic, because we're absolute cliches. You know, if we're stuck at home, we can't make any films. Well, let's make a podcast about films instead. And then I became a dad. And Phil became a dad about 6 months later. And all of a sudden, the ability to rush out like a whole series of podcast episodes became very difficult. So I narrowed it down to like a little sort of specials, a special series of just maybe 5 episodes. I like to produce stuff that's really good quality, even if there's not that much of it. And the horror one that had got into my head, because Midnight Mass had come out on Netflix. Have you seen that yet?
I haven't seen it. I'm really not a horror film guy, but I'm willing to learn.
If you want to start anywhere with horror, start with Midnight Mass on Netflix, because what it has to say about faith and belief is absolutely fascinating. So I built a series around that, and we started with the Exorcist. And one of the trickiest things, and you might relate to this, is being able to find guests for shows, trying to find people who can talk about it interestingly and coherently and give you a real jumping off point or a different perspective to look at.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can tell how hard it is to find guests when we end up inviting you, Giles. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. That was
Chick,
unworthy of me, and I ask your forgiveness.
not at all, Chick. I thought the same thing. I thought, oh, flipping heck, he's really scraping the barrel now. Good Lord. He must be getting splinters under his fingernails. But okay, I've got this one opportunity and I'm going to go for it. So I was really struggling to find a guest for the Exorcist episode. We were going to have someone come on and talk about the film, but they dropped out. And then my boss said to me, my father-in-law performs exorcism for the Diocese of Guildford. Would that be interesting to you? And then I was like, yes, that's fascinating. And that completely changed the course of the way the episode went. Because when we start talking about spiritual warfare, that's not really a topic that's been in vogue with mainstream Christianity, or at least the sort of British C of E kind of Christianity. And it's one of those areas where, put bluntly, the rubber really meets the road. There's no other way you can look at it. So we spoke to Reverend Tim Hillier, and he talked to us all about how he got into performing exorcism as part of deliverance ministry. And it was absolutely fascinating because you're looking for red flags. You're looking for, like, okay, what's the potential for spiritual abuse here? How badly could this go? And then he says, well, we have our medical professionals, and I speak to a psychiatrist and that we have on staff. And then when we've come to a conclusion, and he says that exorcisms are incredibly rare. He's been doing the job for 8 years, and he's had one exorcism that he's dealt with, and the rest of it has just been about deliverance from oppression. He was absolutely fascinating to speak to, and it really sort of, for my co-host Phil, it really blew him out of the water. Absolutely, just hearing from a real life exorcist. So
I'm thinking to even for many Christians, it's a kind of sensational thing, and to have somebody speak about that, down to earth in the best sense, common sense view, and bringing in other disciplines, that's a real contribution.
100%. It made me feel like if you are going to have somebody doing exorcisms, Tim Hillier is exactly the kind of person you want them to be doing it. A very sort of sober, very well put together person who is. Exorcism is one of the areas in faith where doubt has to be the de facto. If somebody says to you, I think I'm possessed, your answer is more likely to be, are you though? Are you sure? And just working through it's honest. It's strange taking a more sort of scientific approach to something that's so faith-based. Does that make sense?
It makes a whole lot of sense, and yet you're right. I think that in any somebody saying I'm possessed, I think your first thing is to ask some very hard questions, and it's great to hear that in that Anglican circle that kind of approach is being used. Giles, the clock is ticking far faster than I wish it would. It always happens when you're having a really interesting conversation. I'm going to switch tack just a little. How do you think the church, and in the context of all your reflections about engaging with popular culture, how can the church remain authentically Christian and still culturally relevant?
Do you know what? When you asked me that question, I thought, good Lord, that is far above my pay grade, but I will have my best go at it as much as I can. The thing that comes back to me was a quote from Tim Keller. He was a guest on their Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and he talked about not being needlessly culturally alien. So let's take your example that you were talking about, being that little boy who says, I cannot go to the pictures, I'm a Christian. We don't do that. Now, on the one hand, that is a fantastic example of standing up for your faith in a mainstream context, and that is great. However, most little boys, I would wager, probably don't end up growing up to be like you, Chick, where you're a Christian and a minister and all these sorts of things. And for most of them, that barrier will become insurmountable. I can't go to the pictures because I'm a Christian. And then I can't do that, and I can't watch TV because I'm a Christian, and I can't read books. And that will break them in some cases. So my feeling is that being a Christian is hard enough as it is. We've all got our own particular challenges on this point. Why make it any more difficult than it needs to be? Young people and everybody is absolutely saturated with messages that we get from popular culture. You can't walk down the street without seeing an advert for a bus or advert on a bus for some film or other. So why just pretend it doesn't exist? Why not just sort of lean into it and say that you can engage with this and you can engage with this from a God angle? Because to me, that is much richer, and it means that people are less likely to think of Christianity as something that they have to, in terms of things they have to give up. Does that make sense?
It makes a whole lot of sense. You know, Giles, we're going to have to stop there because we've got a few extra things to fit into the show this hour. But you're going to make me a promise that you're going to come back on again and we're going to talk some more about these things. Have I got your promise?
100%, Chick. I would absolutely love to do that. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Then, with a big word of thanks, I'm willing to let you go.